In the 1940s, Chinese jump rope became the hottest new craze among Japanese children. Almost every elementary school kid was playing the game before classes. But in one Japanese city, the fun was interrupted by a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, which lit up the very air itself. The morning of August 6, 1945, forever changed not only the Japanese city of Hiroshima, but also the lives of nearly all of its residents. In this video, you'll find out who survived 2 nuclear blasts in a row. Can alcohol really save you from radiation? Why were some of the victims actually relieved to be near the epicenter? And what really happens to a human being after a nuclear explosion? The blast in Hiroshima was so powerful that it affected almost every witness of the disaster, even those several kilometers away from the epicenter. In 1945, many Japanese university students were roped into assisting the army in constructing new military facilities. One such helper was 17-year-old Chisako Takeoka. But that morning, she overslept. She was whipping up some breakfast when a blinding light flooded the sky outside her window. It was so intense that Chisako thought she would stay blind forever. But when her vision gradually returned, she saw that the bright summer day had turned into an eerie twilight. The air was so thick with dust and debris that the sun was just a pale glimmer. Only one thing was discernible through this dusty veil: a massive, fiery mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima. Meanwhile, Chisako's skin was burning. It felt like she had been scalded with boiling water. She was roughly 4 kilometers away from ground zero, and even at that distance, her body barely withstood the blow. Little boy, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima had the power of roughly 15 kilotons in TNT equivalent. That was enough to unleash a scorching heat wave over an area of 9 square kilometers. That's like 3 New York City Central Parks. The exposed skin of every resident caught in this hellish radius reddened and blistered. Moreover, the blinding flash caused by the explosion damaged the retinas of many onlookers. While this condition usually heals on its own, the elderly and others with even minor pre-existing vision issues were blinded forever. Luckily, Chisako Takeoka was still young and her sight eventually returned. As soon as it did, despite her other injuries, she dashed towards downtown through smoky plumes and flames, desperate to find her mother. The river she passed was choked with bloated dead bodies. Meanwhile, Chisako's mouth was so dry that she was yearning for a gulp of water. As if someone up there heard her prayers, rain fell over Hiroshima. But it brought neither relief nor coolness, because this rain was warm and blackened with ash. That day, toxic ash settled on the bodies of over 100,000 Japanese, and in the years to come, there was a surge in cases of pneumoconiosis, a condition where foreign particles eat away at the lungs. On top of that, the poisonous rain that seeped into fresh burn wounds only intensified the inflammation. But Chisako kept going. At the site of her mom's workplace, she found nothing but charred beams and scattered bodies. Chisako remembered her mom had 2 gold fillings in her front teeth. She approached every fallen body, prying open their mouths, checking to make sure it wasn't her mom. Then, odd purple spots began to appear on Chisako's hands, but they vanished before she could pay proper attention to them. She finally saw her mother 6 days later, but only had time for a brief goodbye. Her mother was pulled from the rubble too late, and doctors couldn't do anything to save her. Chisako believed she'd never be able to have children after the atomic bombing, but as time passed, her wounds healed, and a few years later, she gave birth to a son. However, at the hospital, strange purple marks, eerily similar to the ones that had once briefly covered Chisako's own hands, started appearing on the boy's body. Her son died when he was just 17 days old. The doctors said it was due to excessive radiation exposure, as while she was searching for her mother, Chisako had accidentally entered another, far more hazardous zone, just like another unfortunate victim of this catastrophe. How did the explosion impact those unfortunate enough to be 2 kilometers from the epicenter? In the early summer of 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi traveled to Hiroshima on business. August 6th marked his last workday, and by the following morning, he planned to be back in his hometown. The man was hurrying to work when he suddenly heard the roar of an airplane right overhead. Moments later, everything around him lit up. When he finally blinked his eyes open, he found himself sprawled out in a potato field. But Tsutomu had no clue how he got there. Maybe this saved his life, since flying debris couldn't hurt him in the open. Tsutomu was struck by the fact that after such a powerful detonation, the city was so eerily quiet, until he finally realized that blood was dripping from both of his ears. The blast wave had ruptured his eardrums, an injury shared by at least 70,000 other Hiroshima residents. In a daze, Yamaguchi trudged to the remnants of the railway station. There was hardly anyone left to help in Hiroshima. Most medics were either injured themselves or had been killed. Surprisingly, the railway was still functioning. Survivors were sent to other cities on the few tracks left undamaged by the blast. Without hesitation, Yamaguchi set out for his hometown. When he finally made it home, his son screamed in terror and ran away from him. The boy didn't recognize his badly burned father. Despite barely being able to walk, the next morning, Tsutomu got up and limped to work. His work ethic just wouldn't let him miss another day of work. The company's director demanded a full report on Hiroshima. Yamaguchi recounted the hellish ordeal he'd experienced, but his boss didn't believe a word. The director argued that a single bomb couldn't possibly wipe out an entire city. Just at that moment, unbearably bright light engulfed everything around them again. On August 9th, 1945, American forces dropped the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki, Yamaguchi's hometown. Its force clocked in at a whopping 21 kilotons TNT equivalent. However, due to a launch error and the area's unique mountainous terrain, the blast's power didn't exceed that of Hiroshima. In the immediate aftermath, over 40,000 people perished, and at least 70,000 more suffered from radiation sickness in the following years. During both explosions, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was unlucky enough to be less than 2 kilometers from the epicenter, in the most highly radiation-affected zones. The exposed parts of his skin were practically charred, while other parts of his body took on an odd reddish-purple hue. But these weren't ordinary burns. Yamaguchi's skin, and that of thousands of others, was covered in what's known as a nuclear tan, a unique damage caused by excessive ultraviolet radiation. Under its effects, human body cells lose their adhesion and literally shed from the body. That's why many victims of the atomic bombings in Japan bled despite having no visible wounds. The fluid was literally oozing from their skin. But those who managed to survive still had to endure weeks of suffering from radiation sickness. They constantly felt nauseous, suffered from internal bleeding, and some would frequently lose consciousness. What's scarier, they didn't even realize they were dying. Experts call this the walking ghost phase. Even if a victim's bone marrow cells are irreparably splitting, they still feel totally fine for a few more hours. This is why many survivors in August of 1945 only sought medical help the following day, when it was too late. Tsutomu Yamaguchi could well have been one of them, but he survived both explosions and lived to be 93 years old, though he did suffer the effects of radiation for the rest of his life. His body was covered in keloid scars that ached from even the slightest movement, constantly reminding him of the catastrophe. But in one interview, Yamaguchi admitted he was even grateful for the fate that befell him. During the Nagasaki blast, his wife and son were much closer to the epicenter. They only survived because, at that moment, they'd gone to the basement to find burn medication for Yamaguchi. If he hadn't been injured in Hiroshima, the fierce blast wave in Nagasaki would have obliterated his family. After all, that was the grim fate of those who were too close to the explosion. What did the explosion do to those who were unlucky enough to be just 1 kilometer from the epicenter? On the day of the tragedy, 13-year-old Sadao Hirano was on his way to school located in the very heart of the city. The school's principal had asked students to come to class an hour later that morning. Not at 8, but at 9 due to scheduled maintenance work. Thus, he had inadvertently saved the lives of hundreds of children. However, most of them suffered anyway. When the explosion occurred, Hirano had barely a moment to process what was happening. The shockwave literally lifted him off his feet. The boy flew several meters before crashing into a stone wall. Hirano felt like he had broken his arm, but even graver trials awaited him, because a second later, hundreds of sharp glass shards pierced his skin. But others had it worse. A few minutes later, a staggering man passed by Hirano with a wooden pole protruding from his abdomen. It had impaled him straight through. Bleeding profusely from numerous cuts, the boy made his way home. When he finally found his mother, she immediately noticed something clenched in her son's hand. It turned out that Hirano was holding a piece of his own skin, which had peeled off from his palm. Unsure what to do in such situations, his mother made a peculiar decision to smear all of her son's wounds with sake, the traditional Japanese drink. Astonishingly, this is what saved the boy, because 80% of the citizens who were also in the blast radius during the explosion died within the first hours after the detonation, not only from radiation exposure, but also from severe physical injuries. Out of Hirano's 37 classmates, only 3 survived. But even those 3 could hardly be called fortunate. That's because the radiation not only caused severe damage to their soft tissues, but also broke down their DNA structure. After the nuclear explosions in Japan, the incidence of cancer in newborns increased by a staggering 70%. In every 30th baby, a certain mutation was detected. The babies could be born without eyes or with extra limbs. But even if a baby seemed perfectly healthy at first glance, every moment of their subsequent life was under threat. This is Miwa Mitamura. She was born in Hiroshima a quarter century after the disaster. By that time, her mother, Shizuko Mitamura, had been battling colon cancer for several years. But even such a severe diagnosis didn't prevent the woman from giving birth to a healthy baby girl. The doctors called it a true miracle. However, the family couldn't fully rejoice in this event, as within the first few months of Miwa's life, 2 of her aunts, Shizuko's sisters, died from cancer. Their children didn't live much longer. And several years later, both of Miwa's cousins also succumbed to cancer. Of all their relatives affected by the Hiroshima explosion, only Miwa and her mother survived. Ms. Shizuko defeated her cancer over time. She rejoiced, believing that the worst was over. Until many years later, when she received a call from the hospital informing her that her now-grown daughter, Miwa, had passed away. Shizuko couldn't believe the doctor's words, since her child had rarely ever been ill. She later learned from Miwa's friends that she had also been suffering from cancer for several years, but the young woman did everything to keep her mother from knowing about it. Miwa didn't want her mother to feel guilty. She kept hoping that she would recover, but the radioactive aftermath of the Hiroshima disaster caught up with her, even 65 years later. A few months after her daughter's funeral, Ms. Shizuko once again felt that familiar weakness in her body. The doctors confirmed her suspicions. This time, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. Currently, she's still fighting the disease, but notes that she is prepared for the worst. The Hiroshima tragedy gradually took the lives of all of her relatives, and she doesn't expect to be an exception. Meaning it wasn't only the direct witnesses of the nuclear explosions who suffered, but also several subsequent generations of peaceful Japanese citizens. Overall, as many as 1 million residents might well have been affected by the long-term consequences of the nuclear blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sadao Hirano survived. However, for decades after the disaster, he still felt microscopic shards of glass under his skin. They grew into keloid radiation scars on his body. But other victims' bodies underwent even more extensive, fatal transformations. Was anyone able to survive just 300 meters away from the epicenter? On the morning of August 6, 1945, 20-year-old Akiko Takakura was doing her job as a cleaner at the main Hiroshima bank. At some point, she remembers feeling as if God was trying to take a photograph of all of humanity at once using an old camera with a magnesium flash. This bizarre metaphor became her last memory before she fainted. 98% of the victims within 300 meters at the moment of the explosion died instantly. Later, rescuers found bodies of victims whose internal organs had essentially been seared in mere seconds. People literally evaporated. The fluids in their bodies boiled before they could even blink. Many of the corpses were unrecognizable since after the explosion, skin and muscles peeled off, leaving mostly bare skeletons. At least 40,000 civilians met this harrowing fate. Akiko Takakura sustained over 100 severe lacerations and a dose of radiation at least 50 times the daily limit. She was saved by the blast wave that pushed her further along the corridor, and the remaining walls of the building shielded her from even greater radiation. When Takakura regained consciousness, she saw a firestorm filling the entire street and advancing straight towards her. She had only seen such imagery before in book illustrations depicting hell. Mentally, she bid farewell to her life when suddenly she heard a muffled moan from under the debris. It was Ms. Asami, one of the bank's employees. The debris had virtually crushed the woman's legs. Despite everything, Takakura tried to free Ms. Asami, but time was running out, and the firestorm had almost reached the bank. At that moment, something happened that Akiko Takakura still considers a divine blessing. The bank building's water pipes burst. A wave of water engulfed both her and the other employee, preventing the flames from consuming the vestiges of the building. Only due to this were both women able to survive, despite their chances being less than 1%. However, Ms. Asami didn't get a chance to rejoice in her good luck. By the evening after the disaster, her condition had deteriorated so much that she passed away within a few days, never coming out of a coma. Akiko Takakura dedicated the rest of her life to honoring the memory of those who perished during these horrific events. But what happened to those unfortunate souls who found themselves directly at the explosion's epicenter, or ground zero, as it was later termed by the military? Well, these people simply vanished. Within a fraction of a second, their bodies disintegrated into chemical elements. The radiation intensity at that point was so high that even atomic bonds ceased to exist. That flash of such terrible intensity even bleached the dark stones that paved the streets of Hiroshima. Only in some spots did these slabs barely change color. These were places where people had been standing at the moment of the explosion. For instance, an unknown child playing Chinese jump rope. Today, this effect is called a nuclear shadow. Human bodies absorbed all the radiation, leaving behind only eerie silhouettes permanently imprinted in concrete and stone. Before the tragedies in Japan, humanity couldn't even imagine that something like this was possible. Overall, in the immediate days following the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, around 120,000 people perished. At least another 250,000 suffered injuries. And considering the long-term impact of radiation, these disasters harmed over 1 million Japanese citizens. However, it is commonly believed that these horrific events contributed to the capitulation of the Empire of Japan. American generals estimated that without the atomic bombs, a large-scale invasion of the Japanese islands would have been necessary, and this would have cost at least 1 million lives of American and Allied soldiers, as well as several million more casualties among the Japanese. But one question still remains unanswered. Can the use of 2 atomic bombs indeed be justified by the assumption that fewer people suffered from them than might have perished in the continuation of the Second World War? Share your thoughts in the comments.